The Valoran Dominion had ruled the stars for 3,000 years. Their empire stretched across 17 star systems and contained over 200 billion souls. They had conquered species that possessed technology beyond imagination. They had crushed civilizations that had existed for 10,000 years before the Valorans even learned to make fire. Their military was the most powerful force in the known galaxy, and their database contained information on every intelligent species that had ever achieved. SPACE, Fel IGHT. Admiral Kethner stood on the bridge of his flagship, the Eternal Conquest, and watched the stars drift past the observation windows. He was old by Valoran standards, with dark blue scales covering his elongated face and forearms folded behind his back in a posture of absolute confidence. He had commanded fleets for over 60 years and had never known defeat. The very concept seemed foreign to him, like a word from a dead language that no one remembered how to speak. His communications officer approached with a tablet containing the latest sensor readings. A small fleet of ships had been detected near the outer rim of unclaimed space. The vessels were primitive by any standard, constructed from basic metal alloys and powered by nuclear fusion engines. They moved slowly through the void, following predictable paths between a handful of unremarkable worlds. Kethner studied the images with mild curiosity. The ships were ugly things, all function and no elegance. They looked like they had been assembled by creatures who had only recently discovered how to leave their home planet. He ordered his science officers to search the galactic archives for information about this species. The search returned nothing. No species designation. No homeworld coordinates. No diplomatic history. No record of contact with any other civilization. The database that contained detailed files on over 9,000 spacefaring species had no entry for these creatures. This was unusual. The Dominion prided itself on complete information. Their scouts had mapped every corner of the galaxy and cataloged every species capable of building a fire, let alone a starship. Yet somehow these beings had escaped their notice entirely. Kethner felt a flicker of interest. It had been decades since he had encountered something truly new. He ordered his fleet to change course and intercept the unknown vessels. Perhaps these creatures would provide some entertainment before the inevitable conquest. 12,000 light years away. Lieutenant Commander Daniel Hayes sat in the captain's chair of the USS Endurance and read the distress signal for the third time. Mining colony Kepler-7 was under attack. An alien armada of unknown origin had appeared without warning and begun destroying everything in its path. 2 civilian transports had already been lost while attempting to evacuate the population. Over 40,000 people remained on the surface, waiting for rescue that might never come. Daniel was 34 years old with short brown hair and tired eyes that had seen too many difficult decisions. He had joined the United Earth Navy at 18 and had spent his entire adult life serving on one ship or another. The Endurance was his first command, a medium-sized cruiser with a crew of 312. They were not a battleship. They were not equipped for major combat operations, but they were the closest vessel to Kepler-7, and that meant they were going. He pressed the intercom button and addressed his crew. His voice was calm and steady, the way it always was when things became serious. He told them what they were facing. He told them the odds were not in their favor. He told them they could decline this mission if they chose, and no one would think less of them. Then he asked who was willing to fight. Every single crew member volunteered. Commander Lisa Monroe stood beside Daniel and studied the sensor data with growing concern. She was his first officer, a woman of 40 with sharp features and a mind that could process tactical information faster than most computers. The enemy vessels were enormous, some of them over 3 kilometers long. They bristled with weapon systems that her instruments could barely analyze. Energy signatures suggested power sources far beyond anything humanity had developed. She turned to Daniel with a question in her eyes, but he simply nodded. They both understood what this meant. They were outgunned, outmatched, and probably going to die. None of that mattered. Their people needed them. The Endurance was not alone for long. 11 other ships answered the call and joined the rescue mission. They came from patrol routes and border stations, from training exercises and supply runs. Some were proper warships with experienced crews. Others were converted cargo vessels with weapons bolted onto their hulls. Together, they formed the largest human fleet ever assembled for combat. And it was still pathetically small compared to what waited for them. Captain Nathan Cole commanded the USS Resilience, a destroyer that had seen better days. He established communication with Daniel and the other captains to coordinate their approach. Their strategy was simple because complexity was a luxury they could not afford. They would attack directly, hit hard, and hope that aggression could substitute for firepower. Chief Engineer Samantha Wright worked in the engine room of the Endurance, preparing the ship for battle. She was 52 years old and had spent 30 of those years keeping vessels, running with spare parts and stubborn determination. She knew every system on the ship better than the engineers who had designed them. As she rerouted power from non-essential systems to reinforce the shields, she hummed an old song her grandmother used to sing. It helped her concentrate. The two fleets approached each other through the darkness of space. The Valorans came with 47 capital ships, each one capable of destroying a small planet. They came with confidence built on 3,000 years of unbroken victory. They came expecting the unknown species to surrender the moment they understood the situation. The humans came with 12 ships and absolutely no intention of stopping. Admiral Kethner watched the tiny vessels approach and felt something he had not experienced in a very long time. It was not fear. It was not even concern. It was confusion. His tactical officers had calculated the odds and determined that the enemy had zero chance of survival. A rational species would recognize this and surrender. A logical species would negotiate for the best possible terms. But these creatures just kept coming, accelerating towards certain death as though they had somewhere important to be. He ordered his communications officer to broadcast a surrender demand. The message was transmitted in every known language and on every standard frequency. It promised mercy for those who submitted and destruction for those who resisted. It was the same message the Dominion had used for centuries, and it had never failed to produce results. The response was silence. Then the human ships opened fire. The first missiles struck the forward shields of the Valoran cruiser Dominance and exploded in brilliant flashes of light. The damage was minimal, barely scratching the surface of the massive warship. But that was not the point. The point was that someone had dared to shoot first. Admiral Kethner stood perfectly still on his bridge and watched the tiny human ships charge toward his formation. His forearms hung at his sides as his mind struggled to process what he was seeing. In all his years of command, no enemy had ever attacked the Dominion without first attempting negotiation. Every species understood that fighting was pointless. Every species calculated the odds and reached the obvious conclusion. Yet these creatures had simply ignored mathematics and started shooting. He gave the order to return fire. The Valoran fleet unleashed enough firepower to crack a moon. Energy beams sliced through space at the speed of light. Plasma torpedoes left trails of superheated gas in their wake. The void itself seemed to burn as weapons that had shattered. 100 civilizations reached out toward 12 small ships. Captain Daniel Hayes gripped the armrests of his chair as the Endurance shook from a near miss. The shields were holding, but just barely. Alarms screamed throughout the ship as damage reports flooded in from every section. He ignored them all and focused on the tactical display in front of him. There would be time to assess damage later. Right now, they had to survive the next 30 seconds. Commander Lisa Monroe shouted coordinates to the helm officer, plotting a course through the storm of enemy fire. The Endurance twisted and rolled, exploiting gaps in the Valoran formation that should not have existed. The alien ships were designed for overwhelming force, not precision targeting. They expected enemies to hold still and die. They were not prepared for a vessel that refused to cooperate. On the USS Resilience, Captain Nathan Cole coordinated the battle network between all 12 human ships. They shared targeting data and sensor readings in real time, creating a unified tactical picture that allowed them to fight as a single unit. When one ship identified a weakness in an enemy vessel, the information spread to everyone within milliseconds. The first Valoran cruiser died when 3 human destroyers concentrated their fire on its primary reactor. The massive warship had shrugged off individual attacks without difficulty, but the combined assault from multiple angles found a gap in its defenses. The reactor containment failed, and the ship vanished in a sphere of white light that briefly outshone the nearest star. Admiral Kethner stared in his tactical display and felt his scales grow cold. One of his cruisers was gone, destroyed by primitives who should not have been able to dent its paint. He demanded an explanation from his officers, but they had none to give. The mathematics still favored the Dominion overwhelmingly. Yet somehow the humans were winning individual engagements through tactics that made no logical sense. Chief Engineer Samantha Wright crawled through a maintenance tunnel on the Endurance, her hands bleeding from a ruptured conduit she had sealed moments earlier. The main power grid was failing, forcing her to reroute energy through secondary systems that were never designed for combat loads. She worked with tools in both hands and a flashlight clenched between her teeth. Ignoring the burns on her arms from overheated components, she reached the junction box she needed and began rewiring the connections. The ship shuddered again as another blast struck the hull somewhere above her. Dust and debris rained down on her head, but she kept working. The shields needed power. The weapons needed power. Everything needed power, and she was the only one who could provide it. When she finished, she allowed herself 3 seconds to breathe. Then she moved on to the next emergency. Lieutenant Kevin Parker flew his fighter through a debris field that had once been part of a Valoran destroyer. His squadron had started with 12 pilots. Now there were 7. Each loss had felt like a knife in his chest, but he pushed the grief aside and focused on staying alive. There would be time to mourn later. Or there would not, and it would not matter anyway. His targeting computer displayed information about the enemy ships, identifying weak points and power fluctuations. The Valoran vessels were advanced beyond anything humanity had encountered, but they were not invincible. Their designers had assumed that no enemy would ever get close enough to exploit their vulnerabilities. They had not counted on pilots crazy enough to fly directly into the teeth of their defenses. Kevin lined up his shot and fired. His missiles struck the joint between 2 armor plates on a Valoran frigate, exploiting a gap that was barely wide enough to matter. The explosion tore through internal systems and sent the ship spinning out of formation. It was not a kill, but it was damage. And damage accumulated. The battle stretched into its 3rd hour, and something strange began to happen. The Valoran fleet started pulling back, creating distance from the human ships. Admiral Kethner had ordered a tactical pause to reassess the situation. He had lost 4 ships. The humans had lost 2. The numbers still favored the Dominion by an absurd margin, but the trend was wrong. His fleet should have been untouchable. Commander Lisa Monroe noticed the enemy withdrawal and reported it to Daniel. He nodded slowly, his face revealing nothing. They had bought time, but they had not won. The colonists on Kepler 7 were still waiting for rescue, and the Valoran fleet would return once they figured out what was happening. Medical, Officer Christina Blake worked in the Endurance's infirmary, treating the wounded as fast as they arrived. Burns from overloaded consoles, broken bones from impact damage, shrapnel wounds from exploding panels. She moved from patient to patient with calm efficiency, her hands steady even when her heart was racing. One of her patients, a young ensign with a gash across his forehead, asked when he could return to his station. She told him he needed rest. He asked again. She looked into his eyes and saw the same determination that filled everyone on this ship. She cleaned his wound, applied a bandage, and let him go. Admiral Kethner summoned his senior officers for a strategic conference. They gathered around the command table and reviewed the battle data, searching for explanations that would make sense of what had happened. The humans were inferior in every measurable way. Their ships were slower, weaker, and less advanced. Their weapons were primitive. Their shields could barely withstand a sustained barrage. Yet they had destroyed 4 Dominion warships. One of his officers suggested that the humans possessed hidden technology they had not yet revealed. Another proposed that their aggression was a bluff designed to buy time for reinforcements. A third wondered if they were simply insane, too irrational to understand when they were beaten. Kethner considered all of these possibilities and found none of them satisfying. Something else was happening here. Something his experience and training had not prepared him to face. He ordered his fleet to resume the attack, but this time with greater caution. He wanted these humans captured alive. He needed to understand what made them fight this way. On the Endurance, Daniel Hayes looked at the exhausted faces of his bridge crew and made a decision. They would not wait for the enemy to come to them. They would attack first, again, while the Valorans were still confused. It was insane. It was suicidal. It was exactly what these aliens would never expect. He gave the order. The human fleet charged forward once more. The battle stretched from hours into days. The Valoran fleet had fought countless wars across centuries of conquest, and they had developed a clear understanding of how species behaved under pressure. When losses exceeded a certain threshold, enemies surrendered. When victory became mathematically impossible, enemies negotiated. When destruction became inevitable, enemies fled. These were universal truths that applied to every intelligent civilization in the galaxy. The humans, apparently, had not received this information. Admiral Kethner stood at his command station and watched his tactical display with growing unease. The tiny human fleet had been reduced to 8 ships. They should have been broken. They should have been begging for terms. Instead, they were attacking his flanks with renewed ferocity, targeting supply vessels and communication relays with suicidal precision. He demanded reports from his psychology officers. They analyzed the human communications they had intercepted and found nothing that explained the behavior. The creatures were afraid. Their voices carried the unmistakable tones of terror and exhaustion. Yet they kept fighting. It was as though fear and action existed in separate compartments of their minds, with no connection between them. Lieutenant Kevin Parker had been flying his fighter for 18 hours straight. His eyes burned from staring at screens, and his muscles ached from constant maneuvering. The cockpit smelled like sweat and recycled air, and something that might have been blood from a wound he did not remember receiving. His squadron was down to 4 pilots now, and their ammunition was running dangerously low. His targeting computer had failed an hour ago, forcing him to aim manually. It was a skill they taught at the academy, but rarely practiced because computers were supposed to be reliable. Kevin found that he preferred it this way. There was something pure about lining up a shot with nothing but his own eyes and instincts. When he hit a target, he knew it was entirely his doing. His oxygen reserves blinked a warning at him. He was down to 30 minutes of breathable air. Standard procedure would be to return to the Endurance for resupply. But the Endurance was currently engaged with 3 Valoran cruisers, and landing was not an option. Kevin made a decision. He would fight until his air ran out. Then he would figure out what to do next. On the bridge of the Eternal Conquest, Admiral Kethaner received a message from the Dominion High Command. They wanted to know why a simple patrol action had turned into a prolonged engagement. They wanted to know why he had lost 7 ships to an enemy that should have been eliminated in minutes. They wanted explanations, and he had none to give. He drafted his response carefully, describing the enemy tactics without admitting how effective they had been. He emphasized the primitive nature of human technology while downplaying the skill with which it was employed. He assured the High Command that victory was imminent and that the unknown species would soon be cataloged like all the others. He did not mention that he had stopped believing this. Medical Officer Christina Blake had turned the Endurance's cargo bay into an overflow hospital. The main infirmary had filled hours ago, and wounded crew members now lay on improvised beds throughout the ship. She moved among them with a tablet in one hand and a medical kit in the other, triaging injuries and allocating limited supplies. A young man with burns covering half his body grabbed her arm as she passed. He wanted to know if he could still serve. His station had been destroyed, but there were other stations that needed crew. He could still use his hands. He could still think clearly. She looked at his wounds and knew that any other species would have been in shock. Any other patient would have been unconscious from the pain. This man was asking when he could get back to work. She told him to rest. He ignored her and started walking toward the bridge. She watched him go and did not try to stop him. Captain Daniel Hayes had not slept in 2 days. His body was running on stimulants and willpower, and both were running low. The Endurance had taken heavy damage, with entire sections sealed off due to hull breaches. Life support was failing on 3 decks. The main weapons array had been reduced to 40% capacity. By every reasonable measure, his ship was dying. He refused to acknowledge this. Commander Lisa Monroe presented him with a status report that painted a grim picture. Of the 12 ships that had started this battle, only 8 remained. Of those 8, only 3 were fully operational. The enemy still had over 30 capital ships, each one capable of destroying the entire human fleet on its own. The mathematics were clear. Continued resistance was pointless. Daniel looked at her for a long moment. Then he asked how many colonists remained on Kepler-7. She checked her data and told him the number. 37,000 civilians were still waiting for evacuation. 37,000 people who would be killed or enslaved. If the fleet withdrew, he turned back to his display and began planning the next attack. Admiral Kethaner watched another of his destroyers explode and felt something he had almost forgotten existed. It was fear, not the abstract concern of a commander assessing tactical disadvantages, but genuine personal fear. These humans were not fighting like any enemy he had encountered. They were fighting like something from the old legends, the stories of monsters that could not be killed because they did not understand death. He called for another tactical withdrawal, pulling his fleet back to establish a defensive perimeter. His officers were confused. They still held overwhelming superiority. They still possessed every advantage that mattered. But Kethaner understood something they did not. Victory meant nothing if the cost of achieving it was too high. These humans had already destroyed 9 of his ships. If the battle continued at this rate, he would lose a significant portion of his fleet. The Dominion had not lost a significant fleet engagement in over 1,000 years. Lieutenant Kevin Parker's fighter drifted through space, with its engines cold and its weapons empty. He had run out of ammunition 20 minutes ago and out of air 5 minutes later. His cockpit was growing cold as the life support systems failed. The darkness at the edges of his vision was probably lack of oxygen. It was hard to tell. A Valoran frigate passed within visual range, close enough that he could see the lights on its hull. His fighter was too small to register on their sensors, especially without power. He was invisible, forgotten, already dead in every way that mattered. Except he was not dead yet. He spotted an access hatch on the enemy hull, designed for maintenance crews during dock. His fighter still had maneuvering thrusters powered by compressed gas. It would be enough for one approach, one impact, one chance. He did not think about the odds. He did not calculate his chances of survival. He simply acted. His fighter struck the frigate's hull at an angle, tearing through the access hatch and lodging itself in the enemy vessel. Kevin climbed out of his cockpit and found himself inside a Valoran engineering section. Alien crew members stared at him in shock. None of them were armed. None of them had expected a human to physically board their ship. He had no weapons either. Just his hands and his refusal to surrender. The fight that followed was brief and brutal. When it ended, Kevin had control of the engineering section and a very basic understanding of Valoran control systems. He started pressing buttons to see what would happen. The frigate's reactor went critical 8 minutes later. Kevin died in the explosion, but not before sending a message to the human fleet. 4 words that would be remembered for generations. Still fighting. Worth it. The reinforcements arrived on the 3rd day, emerging from faster-than-light transit in a ragged formation that spoke of desperate speed. They were not a proper fleet. They were not even proper warships. They were cargo haulers and passenger liners and mining vessels. Their hulls scarred from hasty modifications, and their crews, composed of volunteers who had never seen combat. They came anyway. Commander Ryan Mitchell stood on the bridge of his transport ship. The cargo holds now empty except for the improvised railgun systems that his engineering team had welded to the support beams. 2 weeks ago, he had been hauling grain between agricultural colonies. Today, he was preparing to fight an alien empire. The transition had happened so quickly that he had not had time to feel afraid. Fear was a luxury for people with options. The civilian convoy numbered 51 vessels. Combined with the survivors of the original fleet, the human force now totaled 63 ships. It was still smaller than the Valoran Armada, but the gap had narrowed considerably. More importantly, the humans now had something they had lacked before. They had numbers. Admiral Kethaner observed the arrival of the human reinforcements and felt his uncertainty deepen. He had contacted the Dominion archives repeatedly over the past 3 days, demanding any information they possessed about this species. The researchers had finally located something, buried in records so old that no one had accessed them in centuries. The humans came from a small planet in a remote spiral arm, orbiting an unremarkable yellow star. They had been observed by Dominion scouts approximately 200 years ago and classified as pre-spaceflight primitives. Their technology at the time had been limited to basic combustion engines and simple electronics. They had been marked for eventual conquest once more valuable targets were secured. Then forgotten. The records contain no mention of their psychology, no analysis of their culture or behavior, no warning about what they might become once they reached the stars. The scouts had seen a primitive species and assumed they would remain primitive forever. They had not understood that humans were different. Communications officer Hannah Sullivan worked at her station on the Endurance, intercepting and analyzing enemy transmissions. Her eyes were red from lack of sleep, and her uniform was stained with coffee and dried blood from a wound she had treated herself. She had been monitoring Valoran communications since the battle began, building a picture of enemy thinking that grew more fascinating by the hour. The aliens were frightened. Their commanders were requesting permission to withdraw entirely, citing unprecedented losses and unpredictable enemy behavior. Their tactical discussions were filled with phrases that her translation software rendered as confusion and disbelief. They had never encountered a species that fought this way. They did not know how to respond. One phrase appeared repeatedly in their transmissions, used by commanders and crew members alike. Hannah's software struggled to find an exact translation, but the meaning was clear. These humans did not know how to surrender. Captain Daniel Hayes received the news of the reinforcements with a mixture of relief and concern. More ships meant more firepower, but it also meant more lives at risk. Many of the volunteer crews had no combat training. Their vessels were fragile compared to proper warships. They would die easily if the battle turned against them. He called a conference with the other captains, their faces appearing on screens around the Endurance's bridge. Some were military officers like himself. Others were civilian pilots who had never fired a weapon in anger. All of them wore the same expression of tired determination. They had come to fight, and they would not leave until the fighting was done. Daniel outlined his strategy. The civilian ships would provide support, harassing enemy flanks while the military vessels engaged the main Valoran formation. They would coordinate their attacks through the battle network, sharing information and targeting data in real time. They would exploit every weakness the enemy revealed and create weaknesses where none existed. It was not a brilliant plan. It was simple and direct, relying more on aggression than subtlety. But that was what they needed. Complexity required resources they did not have. Subtlety required time they could not spare. All they had was the willingness to charge straight at the enemy and see who blinked first. Admiral Kethner reviewed his own tactical options and found them increasingly limited. He could destroy the human fleet if he committed his full force, but the cost would be severe. He could withdraw and request reinforcements from the Dominion, but that would mean admitting failure. He could negotiate, but the humans had not responded to any communication attempts. He chose to attack. The Valoran fleet advanced in a wall of metal and energy, weapon systems charging for a devastating first strike. They would overwhelm the human formation through sheer firepower, burning through shields and hulls until nothing remained. It was the same strategy they had used for 3,000 years. It had never failed. The humans did not wait to receive the assault. They charged forward instead, closing the distance before the Valoran weapons could achieve optimal range. The two fleets met in a collision of light and fire that lit up the darkness for millions of kilometers in every direction. Chief Engineer Samantha Wright felt the endurance shudder as multiple impacts struck the hull simultaneously. Warning lights flashed across her console, indicating failures in systems throughout the ship. She prioritized the critical functions and let the minor ones fail. Sensors could be rebuilt. Weapons could be repaired. Life support was all that truly mattered. A hull breach opened on Deck 7, venting atmosphere into space. Samantha sealed the section remotely and routed emergency oxygen to the affected areas. Crew members were trapped on the other side of the breach. She could hear their voices on the internal communications, calm despite their situation. They were manually sealing doors to prevent further decompression. They were saving themselves because they refused to wait for rescue. Commander Lisa Monroe tracked the battle's progress on her tactical display, calling out targets and coordinating with allied ships. The fighting was brutal and chaotic, with vessels from both sides taking damage in exchanges that lasted seconds. The Valarans had superior firepower, but the humans had superior positioning. They weaved through enemy formations, striking from unexpected angles and withdrawing before counterattacks could land. The mining ship Dawn Treader, captained by a woman named Grace Cooper, rammed a Valoran cruiser that had been targeting the Endurance. The impact destroyed both vessels instantly, killing everyone aboard. Grace had known what would happen when she gave the order. She had done it anyway, because the Endurance was the command ship and had to survive. Ryan Mitchell watched the Dawn Treader explode and said nothing. There were no words for what he was feeling. Grace had been his friend for 20 years. They had shared meals and stories and long conversations about their futures. Now she was gone, and the only way to honor her sacrifice was to keep fighting. He ordered his ship to attack. The battle raged for 6 hours. And when it ended, the space around Kepler 7 was filled with wreckage from both fleets. The Valorans had lost 18 ships. The humans had lost 23. But the Valorans were withdrawing, their remaining vessels pulling back toward the edge of the system. Admiral Kethner stared at his tactical display and knew that he had lost. Not the battle, perhaps. The mathematics still favored his fleet by a small margin. But he had lost something more important. He had lost his certainty. These humans could be killed. They were fragile creatures in fragile ships, and they died as easily as any other species. But they did not stop. They did not break. They kept coming and coming and coming, and eventually, even the mightiest empire would run out of ships to sacrifice. He ordered his fleet to hold position and prepare for the final engagement. The humans would attack again. He was certain of this. They would attack because that was all they knew how to do. The final engagement began at dawn on the 4th day, though dawn meant nothing in the void of space. It was simply the time that Captain Daniel Hayes chose to attack because he needed a marker to separate one moment from the next. The human fleet advanced in a formation that had no name in any tactical manual. It was simply a mass of ships moving together toward a common enemy, unified by nothing except their refusal to stop. The Valoran fleet waited in defensive positions, their weapons charged and their shields at maximum. Admiral Kethner had studied the human tactics and prepared countermeasures. He had positioned his ships to create overlapping fields of fire. He had established fallback positions and communication protocols for coordinated responses. He had done everything that centuries of military experience had taught him to do. None of it mattered. The humans came with a ferocity that defied rational analysis. Ships with critical damage positioned themselves as shields for less damaged vessels, absorbing fire that would have destroyed more valuable targets. Pilots ejected from destroyed fighters and continued firing personal weapons at enemy hulls, accomplishing nothing but refusing to quit. Engineers performed repairs while under direct fire, welding circuits together with hands that should have been shaking. Lieutenant Commander Samantha Wright stood in the Endurance's engine room as explosions rocked the ship around her. The main reactor was failing, its containment field fluctuating in ways that meant imminent destruction. Standard procedure would be to evacuate the section and let the automated systems handle the crisis. Samantha was not interested in standard procedure. She climbed into the reactor housing and began making adjustments manually, her hands protected by gloves that were already melting from the heat. The containment field stabilized under her touch, not because her modifications were theoretically sound, but because she simply refused to let the reactor fail. It was not science. It was stubbornness dressed up as engineering. Admiral Kethner watched his tactical display and saw something that made his scales turn pale. His ships were winning individual engagements. His weapons were destroying human vessels at a steady rate. But the rate of destruction was not enough. For every human ship that died, another continued fighting. For every attack that succeeded, another was launched. The mathematics of attrition were working against him. He had started this battle with 31 ships. He now had 17. The humans had started with 40 vessels and now had 26. The numbers had shifted in their favor, not through superior firepower or technology, but through something he could not quantify. They were simply more willing to die. Captain Nathan Cole of the USS Resilience reported that his ship was crippled, unable to maneuver or fire weapons. Daniel ordered him to withdraw, but Nathan refused. He had one functioning system remaining, the main drive, and he intended to use it. The Resilience accelerated toward the largest Valoran battleship in the enemy formation. picking up speed with each passing second. The collision destroyed both vessels instantly. The shockwave disrupted the Valoran formation, creating gaps that the remaining human ships exploited with savage efficiency. 3 more enemy vessels died before the aliens could restore their coordination. Medical officer Christina Blake had stopped counting the wounded hours ago. The number no longer mattered. What mattered was the next patient, the next wound, the next decision about who could be saved and who could not. She worked without rest, her hands moving with mechanical precision while her mind stayed focused on the task in front of her. A young woman arrived with injuries that should have been fatal. Her internal organs were damaged, her blood pressure was dropping, and her chances of survival were essentially zero. Christina performed surgery anyway, stabilizing what could be stabilized and hoping that hope would be enough. The young woman survived. She would never walk again, but she was alive. In a battle where death came so easily, every life saved was a victory. Commander Lisa Monroe tracked the enemy fleet's movements and noticed something changing. The Valoran ships were no longer advancing. They were no longer maintaining their formations. They were drifting, their movements uncertain and hesitant. She reported this to Daniel, and he understood immediately. The aliens were afraid, not the fear of tactical disadvantage or strategic miscalculation. This was primal fear, the kind that came from facing something that violated every understanding of how the universe worked. The Valorans had conquered species for thousands of years, and in all that time, they had never encountered an enemy like this. They did not know how to fight creatures that welcomed death. Admiral Kethner received a message from his remaining captains. They wanted to withdraw. They wanted to abandon the system and return to Dominion space. Some of them were panicking, their voices cracking with emotions that Valoran officers were not supposed to display. The mighty fleet that had never known defeat was breaking apart from the inside. He gave the order to retreat. The Valoran ships turned and accelerated away from the battlefield, leaving behind wreckage and debris that would orbit this system for centuries. They fled toward the border of their empire, carrying stories of the monsters they had encountered, the creatures from the uncharted regions, the species that was not in any records. Captain Daniel Hayes watched the enemy withdrawal and felt nothing resembling triumph. He was too tired for celebration. The Endurance was barely functional, its hull breached in a dozen locations and its crew reduced by half. The battle was over, but the cost had been enormous. He opened a channel to the surviving ships and spoke 3 words that would be recorded in human history forever. We held together. The evacuation of Kepler-7 began immediately. Transport ships descended to the colony and began loading civilians, carrying them to safety while the exhausted fleet stood guard. 37,000 people would survive because 12 ships had decided to fight. Admiral Kethner filed his report to the Dominion High Command from the safety of a border station. He described the battle in clinical terms, emphasizing the tactical challenges and the unexpected enemy capabilities. He recommended that the human species be classified as a severe threat and that no further contact be attempted without overwhelming force. His final recommendation was studied in Dominion war colleges for generations to come. It said simply this: some species cannot be conquered because they do not recognize the concept of defeat. The humans are such a species. Our archives contain no record of them because no previous enemy survived long enough to create one. The High Command accepted his assessment and added the human territories to the list of regions to avoid. The Great Valoran Dominion, conqueror of 17 star systems, drew a line on their maps and wrote a warning beside it. Here there be monsters. Commander Lisa Monroe assumed command of the rebuilt Endurance 3 months later. Daniel Hayes had survived the battle but retired from active service, his body worn out from years of sacrifice. He spent his remaining days on a quiet colony world. watching the stars and remembering those who had not returned. Humanity had announced its presence to the galaxy, not through diplomacy or trade, but through the simple refusal to die quietly. The records would remember this. The empires would learn to be cautious. And somewhere in the darkness between stars, other species would hear the stories and wonder what kind of creatures could make the mighty Dominion afraid. The answer was simple. They were human. They did not know how to surrender. And they never would.